assessment in e-school was really tough because you didn't know if the kids were doing the work themselves. You didn't know if they were getting help. I mean, you could tell they were grade 7. You could tell sometimes, okay, like maybe mom or dad did this assignment for you. So that was just kind of hard to keep them like accountable of their own work, things like that. But one thing that I did like about eSchool is that when you're kind of like monitoring your students, when you're assessing them regularly, I could reach out to them individually in private and say, hey, I'm not sure if you're understanding this. Let me know if you want a one-on-one Zoom and we can do it together. So I found that students are much more likely to engage in that type of teaching and assessment practice rather than standing in front of a class and saying, put your hand up if you get it. Because a lot of kids will just sit there and be like, yeah, okay, and put my hand up, and they don't actually get it. So
yeah,
eSchool was kind of nice because it was more one-on-one, and you could kind of like hand pick students out and be like, hey, I think you're struggling. Like, are you struggling? And then you kind of get students to explain it that way.
Right.
So that was kind of nice. I find that like even now, like in the class that I'm in right now, it's not always beneficial to ask, like, does anybody have any questions? Because usually they just sit there quietly. Like now I'm with high school students, so they're not always like very engaged. But then when it comes to validity, reliability, and like my professional judgment, all very like interrelated, of course, but I find that the most important piece of all three would be validity, just because when you're assessing, you need to remember like, what is the purpose of this? Like there needs to be a purpose of the assessment. A lot of times like in schools, like in university classes, they'll say, oh, you need to have a certain number of grades inputted by the end of the year and all this stuff. And then it causes teachers to just be like, oh, I'm just going to assess for whatever. When like some of those assessments don't actually make sense. They don't actually follow the outcomes, the indicators, things like that. So you really have to think like, why am I doing this assessment? What's its purpose? So like I find that validity is like the biggest piece of that. And then reliability, consistency, and accuracy. I find that that's very different depending on the students you have. So if you do something like an exit slip, that might not be as accurate in the sense that students can maybe look off one another. If it's just like a quick exit slip at the end of class, they might just be like, oh, what'd you get for that? And then throw it in, right, just to get it done quickly and whatever. So that one, like accuracy, I'm not too sure. Consistency is also very tough because in some classes you'll have different conversations, right? So if I teach like the same class this year as I do next year, we're going to have different conversations about class curriculum and class content this year that we will do next year. So if I use the exact same test, is that really going to be like a consistent teaching practice that I used, I guess? Because like you could have questions come up from students that won't come up the second semester.
Right, yeah.
So, like, are you actually assessing them on something that is valid, something that has a purpose? Will they be able to actually answer those questions based on what you taught, not based on like the conversations you had? So just like kind of like moving like year to year, semester to semester, just based on the class that you have. Making your tests more accurate means you have to like base it on what you taught that semester. So like I know lots of teachers will just use the same test over and over and over again, but like that class that they're teaching isn't always going to be the same lessons, right? Also, the test writing conditions for everyone are going to be different too, right? So one class, maybe there's, I don't know, maybe you have a chatty person in the class and they don't stop talking during tests. That's going to be a different writing environment, so it won't be consistent as compared to like the previous semester, whereas maybe they had a completely quiet classroom. It's like those kind of things.
Yeah.
And then I find that like my professional judgment is almost better than using like hands-on tests. It's often more reliable because a lot of the times like anxiety, mental health, things like that can impact students when they're writing tests. So if I use my professional judgment and say, does this kid know how to actually use this math formula, instead of saying, can you do it on a test for me? like almost like showing me they know how rather than just telling me on paper that they know how.
Yeah.
Is kind of like a big thing. So like using that professional judgment, because a lot of times like kids will just mess up on tests, like they have a bad day, whatever's going on, right? And it's not really like a true representation of what they actually know. So doing something more like hands-on or having one-on-one conversations with them to actually test what they know can often be like just a better option. But obviously that's not always possible because you have 30 kids and one teacher, so you can't do that for everyone. So it's kind of like just like juggling between three is tough. So this one I found works way better in-person teaching rather than online. But when I teach lessons, I find that, okay, yeah, some kids can get it, but with the elementary grading system, it's like exemplary, meeting, approaching, and beginning. I find that if I teach it once, nobody's hitting that top tier 4. Nobody's at exemplary, unless maybe they've done it for years and years and years, right? Like none of the students should be at that point yet. So we will have some students meeting, and then we'll have some beginning, some approaching. So what I like to do is kind of push the students who are at the meeting level to maybe explore and see if they can reach the exemplary level. So that takes them, that's more like individualized learning. They can see if they can figure it out on their own, because that's what will take them to the exemplary level. But then also with the kids who are still in beginning and approaching, I can focus a little bit more with them, but also the students who are in meeting can also reach exemplary by working with students who are at beginning and approaching as well.
Okay.
So yeah, so I find that like usually I haven't ever had a kid that's been exceeding expectations right after they learn a topic. So then I spend a little bit more time like with the lower level ones, and the ones that are meeting, they can work with us and then maybe have their own challenge as well to get that extra step. I would test probably everybody the exact same level, depending, like, I'm not really sure how ROAs and things like that work in elementary schools, like adaptations, but I'd probably test everyone the exact same to begin, see who my higher ones are, see who my lower ones are, and then do different tests just to get them to step up to that higher level. So maybe like a little bit easier readings, a little bit easier questions, and then dig deeper to actually get to see if they have that comprehension. So this one, very interesting. I guess just to start with like culturally responsive, just being careful with using examples and questions and everything like that, because not everyone may understand the words that you're using. So like, I don't know, like if you're using an example about Halloween, or like something that has to do with like maybe very Canadian products, or like something that you're a bunny hug, things like that. Kids might not understand what that means, might not feel comfortable asking, and then fail because they don't have that same cultural background for what the question's asking about. So using like common holidays, practices, things like that is like, if you are going to use them, you need to use them from all over the place, so that you're learning, like you're teaching your students about your culture, but you're also learning about theirs. So it's not just like a one view of like kind of what you're using, right? And then equitable practices. I'm a huge like equity versus equality person. So especially when I worked with the blind students, they're all mainstream students. They take regular high school classes, but they're blind. So I was working with the one student who was in pre-calc 20 and she's in pre-calc 30 this year. So taking tests for her, obviously it wasn't equal because the other students didn't take tests with somebody scribing for them, but she needed that. Or like for graphing, for example, we would use, it was like a cork board, so she could put push pins in and then feel where the graph was. And so she would make the graph, she'd feel the graph, she would read me the points that she has, and then I would confirm either, yes, that's the points that you should be on as per the example, or no. So it's kind of like the old saying of like, would you ask would you test a monkey to swim and a fish to climb a tree? Like, it's just like, you need to be able to kind of make it equal without actually just giving everybody the same plate kind of thing.
Right.
So, yeah, huge thing for like equity, and that's like forever changing. Everybody's going to have different needs, so like you just need to be flexible, and some students will do well with writing basic tests and some really will not. So it's kind of like making sure you're doing equity over equality.
Okay.
Assessing online was like a nightmare a lot of the time, because again, like, you didn't know if it was a true representation of what the student's ability was giving you. Like, you didn't know if the parent did it, you didn't know kind of what went on. So there also wasn't a lot of opportunity to formally assess. It was more summative, because when we were in e-school, we didn't have any mandatory meetings. It was like, they came if they wanted to, if they didn't, then that's fine. It was like asynchronous learning. So formative didn't really exist too much.
Yeah.
Because we couldn't really just do a quick check-in, because sometimes you didn't see kids for 3 weeks.
That's interesting.
It was tough. So a lot of things were summative.
Yeah.
And they were just like online tests that like you could take, but who knows if they were looking at their notes or using another computer or like whatever, right? So that one was hard. Like, assessing was very, very tough. I honestly, like, I was only there for a year, so, and it was the very first year that they did e-school. So there was like a whole bunch of kinks they were trying to work out and things like that. So I honestly, going in to do things differently, it's hard because they were young, but like, if they were older, I'd probably say, okay, we're gonna do our tests on our computers, like with our screens on and our videos on and everything, so I can kind of see that this is your work coming from you.
Right.
They were grade 7, so a lot of them never put their cameras on anyways.
Yeah.
So it would just have to be, I think, like the school division's more like a set outline of this is what we expect for assessment protocols, because they didn't have any in place. It was just like, test whatever you want. So it was kind of messy that way.
Yeah.
And then I also found during that time, and actually during high school classes, assessing content can be tricky if you have students who are of specific cultural backgrounds or religious backgrounds that it is against their beliefs to learn about that curriculum. So sexual education, a huge one. There's quite a few students I have had that their parents are like, we don't give consent. We don't want our kids learning about this. This isn't part of our beliefs. So then it's like, what do? You've got, like, it's part of the curriculum. You've got some kids that are doing it, and then some kids that are just going to choose not to do it or can't do it. Like, how do you make those assessments fair, right?
Right.
So those ones, I left it more open to discussion rather than just lecturing, like spitting out information and having them regurgitate it back to me. It was more like I assessed students on the ability to explain themselves without being questioned about specific curriculum. So like, we could have a whole unit on sexual health, and I could ask the question, what are 3 things that you need to keep yourself healthy? They could pick from any type of unit that we did. So if they did learn about sexual health, it would just give them that extra information. But if they didn't, it's not like they would be SOL, right? They would still have some opportunity to explain themselves and be like, well, I would do this and this and this.
Yeah. So
just kind of ways that is most like appropriate for them to kind of be included in the testing and stuff. So yeah, it's interesting. And some principals will just say, well, that sucks, give them a 0 because it's part of the curriculum. Yeah. And some will be like, oh, you can try to work with them as best as you can. But yeah, we've had, like, my principal at e-school, he was the one who was just like, well, it's part of the curriculum, so if they don't do it, give them a 0. And I was like, okay. Patience is a huge one, because not all students are going to be able to have the same testing abilities, right? So being patient, figuring out what works for your students, what doesn't work for your students, and that's going to be different every single class you have. So being patient and then trial and error. So if you try something that works with one class and it doesn't work, it might work with another class that you have. It just depends on the students, right? So just like keeping an open mind, learning to like grow as you go and figure out that like just because this didn't work this time means it might work next time, or because it worked this time, maybe it means it might not work next time. It's just like a lot of trial and error. Honestly, just testing it out is like the biggest thing.
Yeah.
Another thing is don't try to reinvent the wheel. Like I know lots of especially new teachers go in and they're like, oh, I want to be different in this way, this way, and this way. And sometimes just going back to like standardized testing sometimes is the thing that we have to do. So like it's great to explore other things, which is it's like awesome. But sometimes like don't be afraid if you have to go back to be like, we're doing a written test. Because sometimes you just have to. Like you can't get around certain things. So yeah, doing new things is great, but don't reinvent the wheel. Don't put so much pressure on yourself that you have to think that you're going to try to do different assessments for every test throughout the year. Like you'll burn out.
Okay.
So, that, and then I would say the other thing, I like to have my students like show rather than know. So rather than give them a test and like have them write down whatever information that they can memorize, show me that you know that. So like some students do well with that and some don't, which is very, very interesting. So some will like really do well with like, I'll memorize this and then just spit it out on paper, and some will actually be able to show you. Some can do neither, honestly. Some could do both. But I like to tell my kids, like, I want you to be able to show me rather than just tell me that you know it. So that's like another thing that I kind of go by when I'm like creating tests and doing those kind of things. I've used a couple like apps, like when I was in my pre-internship, I used a couple apps to do like some assessment, and one of my classes, it absolutely was just a shit show, went horrible, like never again. Used it with the second class. It was the same class, just different kids, and it went so well. So I was like, one is more tech savvy and the other isn't, like just very, very different.